Nobody told humanity about the stars. Nobody warned them. Nobody invited them. For thousands of years, while humans fought their wars, built their cities, and dreamed of the sky, 12 ancient species watched them from the dark. They called themselves the Galactic Council, and they had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. To them, humanity was nothing, a small, angry species on a small, wet rock, too primitive and too violent to deserve a seat at the table. The Council's policy on Earth was simple: leave them alone and wait for them to destroy themselves. But humans had a habit of doing the opposite of what the universe expected. By the year 2319, humanity had spread beyond its home. They had built cities on Mars, stations in orbit around Jupiter, and mining outposts on moons that didn't even have names yet. And then a scientist named Lucas Vance did something that the 12 elder species believed was impossible. He tore a hole in the fabric of space itself and pushed a ship through it. It was not elegant. It was not graceful. A method was crude, violent, and dangerous, but it worked. Humanity had faster-than-light travel, and they had built it with brute force and stubbornness. The first ship to fly beyond the solar system was the Adamant, a deep space exploration vessel under the command of Nathan Cole. Cole was 41 years old, tall, quiet, and built like a man who had spent his whole life carrying weight without complaining about it. He had served in the United Earth Coalition Navy for 20 years, and he had never once raised his voice in a briefing. He didn't need to. When Nathan Cole spoke, people listened because he never wasted a single word. His crew was small but sharp. Lieutenant Megan Hobbs served as the ship's weapons specialist. She was younger than Cole by a decade, louder by a mile, and had a reputation for speaking her mind even when it got her in trouble. She had been disciplined twice in her career for insubordination, and both times her commanding officers had quietly admitted she had been right. Dr. Lucas Vance himself had joined the mission as Chief Science Officer. He was thin, pale, and nervous, the kind of man who looked like he hadn't slept in years, mostly because he hadn't. He had invented the drive that made this journey possible, and he wanted to see where it led. The Adamant jumped to the Kepler 442 system on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. What they found there changed everything. Floating in the empty space between two barren planets was a beacon. It was enormous, bigger than the Adamant itself, a spinning structure of dark metal and pulsing light. It was broadcasting a signal in over 1,000 languages, none of which were human. Vance worked through the night to translate it. When he finally cracked it, he read the message aloud to the bridge crew, and the room went silent. The message said, "Primitive species are not permitted beyond this marker. Turn back, or face correction." Nathan Cole stared at the screen for a long time. Megan Hobbs stood beside him with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. Vance looked like he was going to be sick. The message was clear. Someone out there knew about humanity. Someone out there had decided, without ever meeting them, that humans were not good enough to explore the stars. And someone out there had put up a fence to keep them in. Cole turned to his helmsman and said, "Keep going." They made it 6 hours past the beacon before the ships appeared. 12 vessels, each one 3 times the size of the Adamant, dropped out of warp in a perfect formation. They were sleek, dark, and covered in angular plates that looked like the scales of some enormous reptile. These were Draven warships, the military arm of the Galactic Council, and they had been waiting. A transmission came through. The face on the screen was not human. It was tall, scaled, and cold, with eyes like polished stone. The creature introduced itself as Vorath Sullen, commander of the Border Enforcement Fleet. His voice was flat and bored, like a man swatting a fly. "You have violated sovereign space," Vorath said. "Your vessel and crew are now property of the hegemony. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Nathan Cole opened a channel. He looked at the alien commander and said, very calmly, "We're not anybody's property. We're from Earth." Vorath didn't even blink. He gave an order, and one of his ships fired. The shot wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to teach a lesson. It tore through the Adamant's port stabilizer and sent the ship spinning. Alarms screamed. Crew members were thrown from their seats. Megan Hobbs caught herself on a railing and shouted something that would have gotten her disciplined again. Vance hit the floor and cut his forehead open on the edge of a console. Cole grabbed the arm of his chair and held on. When the ship steadied, he looked at the damage reports. They were alive. Barely. The Adamant could still move, but it couldn't fight. Not against 12 warships. "Get us out of here," he said. The Adamant limped home carrying scorch marks on its hull, wounded crew in its medical bay, and a story that would set the world on fire. When the news reached Earth, the reaction was not fear. It was not confusion. It was fury. President Dana Whitfield addressed the United Earth Coalition 3 days later. She was a small woman with silver hair and steady hands, and she had been a diplomat for 30 years. She had spent her career believing that every conflict could be solved with words. But when she stood at that podium and looked out at the representatives of every nation on Earth, her voice carried something new, something harder. "We reached for the stars," she said, "and something out there slapped our hand. They put up a wall and told us to stay behind it. They shot at our ship and called us property. They didn't ask who we were. They didn't care." She paused. "I have sent a message to whoever is out there, asking for an explanation, asking for dialogue. I received no response. Silence. That is what the galaxy thinks of us." She straightened her back. "So here is what we are going to do. We are going to build. We are going to prepare. And if they come for us, we are going to be ready." Behind closed doors, Whitfield authorized a classified program called Project Longbow. She appointed Admiral Greg Sutton to lead it. Sutton was old, gray, and mean, the kind of officer who had been preparing for a war his entire life, and had finally been given permission to fight one. Within a month, shipyards on Earth, Mars, and the Jovian stations began working around the clock. Humanity didn't know exactly what was coming, but they knew it was coming. And when it arrived, they intended to meet it standing up. In his quarters aboard the Adamant, still docked for repairs, Nathan Cole sat alone and stared at the scar the Draven weapon had left on his ship. Megan Hobbs found him there. "We're going back out there, aren't we?" she asked. Cole didn't look away from the scar. "Yes," he said. "But next time, we're not going to run." 5 years passed, and the galaxy forgot about the little ship that had crossed a line. The Galactic Council held its session on Anthara, the hollow world at the center of their empire, and the 12 elder species discussed humanity the way a gardener might discuss a weed. It was a small problem. It would be handled. The Draven hegemony proposed Resolution 471, a simple mandate that authorized their fleet to push humanity back to its home system, dismantle its colonies, and confiscate its ships. The vote was unanimous. Not one species objected. Not one voice asked whether this was right. To the Council, it wasn't a question of right or wrong. Humans were a lower species. Lower species did not get to say no. The Draven chose their target carefully. New Rochelle was a mining colony on the edge of the Tau Ceti system. It was small, quiet, and far from Earth. 42,000 people lived there, most of them miners, engineers, and their families. The colony had 6 patrol frigates for defense, commanded by Captain Kyle Jenner, a young officer who had never seen real combat. He never got the chance to learn. The Draven fleet arrived without warning. 200 warships dropped out of warp above New Rochelle, and opened fire before Jenner could even finish his distress signal. The 6 frigates lasted less than 4 minutes. The colony shields held for another 12. And then there was nothing. The Draven burned New Rochelle to the ground. They destroyed the habitation domes, the mining rigs, the hospitals, the schools. They didn't land troops. They didn't take prisoners. They simply erased the colony from existence and moved on, the way someone might crush an anthill without breaking stride. 42,000 people died in less than 20 minutes. Men, women, and children. Families who had gone to sleep that night, believing they were safe. The youngest victim was 3 months old. The distress signal reached Earth 14 hours later. It was broken, full of static, and it ended mid-sentence. But it was enough. When the UEC military confirmed what had happened, the news spread across every screen, every channel, and every city on Earth. People stood in the streets and stared at their phones. They sat in their living rooms and watched the footage in silence. For a moment, the entire planet held its breath, and then the breath came out as a roar. President Dana Whitfield called an emergency session of the coalition. She walked to the podium with the names of all 42,000 dead loaded on a tablet in her hand. She set it down on the podium and didn't touch it again. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew. They didn't send a warning, she said. They didn't make demands. They didn't ask us to surrender. They killed our people because they decided we don't matter. Her voice was quiet, but it filled every corner of the chamber. I spent my life believing in diplomacy. I spent my career believing that words could solve anything. I was wrong. You cannot negotiate with someone who doesn't see you as a person. You cannot reason with someone who thinks you are an insect. She looked out at the assembled leaders. We are going to make them see us. That night, Whitfield authorized the full activation of Project Longbow. Admiral Greg Sutton had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and he was ready. The shipyards had not been idle. While the rest of Earth had hoped for peace, Sutton had been building for war. He had overseen the construction of 300 warships, each one designed from the ground up to fight and win against enemies who were older, bigger, and more advanced. They used energy shields that shimmered like water, plasma weapons that fired in precise, elegant beams, and engines that hummed so quietly you could barely hear them. They were works of art. Sutton's ships were not works of art. They were ugly, heavy, and brutal. They were covered in thick armor plating instead of energy shields, because Sutton didn't trust anything he couldn't touch. They carried kinetic accelerators, massive railguns that fired slugs of solid metal at a fraction of the speed of light. They carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and they carried a new weapon that Dr. Lucas Vance had spent 3 years perfecting, something he called the crack drive torpedo. It was, in simple terms, a weaponized version of humanity's subspace engine. When it detonated, it tore a hole in local space-time and crushed everything within a kilometer. It was the most terrifying weapon anyone had ever built. He built it anyway. The first ship off the line was the UES Ironclad, a dreadnought-class warship that looked like someone had welded a fortress to an engine. Its commander was Megan Hobbs, now promoted to full commander. She had spent 5 years training for this. She had run simulations, studied Draven tactics, and drilled her crew until they could fight in their sleep. When she stepped onto the bridge of the Ironclad for the first time, she ran her hand along the console and smiled. "All right," she said to her crew. "Let's go pick a fight." Admiral Sutton organized the fleet into 3 strike groups. The first expeditionary fleet, led by Hobbs, was sent to liberate the Tau Ceti system. Their orders were simple: find the Draven, hit them hard, and make them remember it. Hobbs jumped her fleet into Tau Ceti expecting a battle. What she found was a graveyard. The wreckage of New Rochelle still floated in orbit, blackened and broken. The Draven had left behind a garrison of 60 ships, a standard occupation force. They didn't expect anyone to come back. They certainly didn't expect what came next. The Ironclad fired first. A kinetic accelerator round crossed the distance between the 2 fleets in less than a second, and punched clean through the hull of a Draven cruiser. The ship broke apart like a glass bottle hit with a hammer. The Draven commander barely had time to order a counterattack before Hobbs launched a wave of crack drive torpedoes into the center of their formation. The torpedoes detonated. Space itself screamed. 3 Draven warships were crushed into nothing, folded into pockets of twisted spacetime that collapsed in on themselves like paper being crumpled. The remaining Draven ships scattered in panic. They had never seen anything like this. Their shields, designed to stop energy weapons, did nothing against solid metal moving at impossible speeds. Their elegant formations fell apart as human ships drove into them like wolves into a flock. The battle lasted 2 hours. When it was over, the Draven had lost 60 ships. Humanity had lost 11. The wreckage of New Rochelle drifted silently between the debris of the alien fleet that had destroyed it. Hobbs stood on the bridge of the ironclad and looked at the field of broken ships. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She thought about the 42,000 people who had died here, and the 3-month-old baby whose name she had read in the casualty report. Then she opened a channel to Earth. "Tau Ceti is clear," she said. "They know we're here now." On the other side of the galaxy, the news reached the council chambers on Anthara. The 12 elder species stared at the report in disbelief. A primitive species had not only fought back, it had won. Decisively. Vorath Sullen, the Draven commander who had once shot at the adamant and called humanity property, stood before the council and delivered a warning that nobody wanted to hear. "I told you 5 years ago," he said. "I fired on their ship and watched them run, but I saw something in their eyes that day. These creatures do not fight like prey. They fight like something that has been cornered and has nothing left to lose. You poked a small animal in a dark hole, and now it has come out with its teeth bared. If you do not take this seriously, it will be the last mistake this council ever makes." The council dismissed his warning. The Lirani delegate called it dramatic. The Tessic representative noted that one battle did not make a species dangerous. The Moharan collective said nothing at all, but their ambassador quietly began studying Earth's history that evening. On Earth, in a shipyard orbiting Mars, Nathan Cole watched as the hull of a brand-new warship was welded into place. He had been promoted twice since the Adamant incident. He was a Commodore now, with a fleet of his own being built around him. He read Hobbs's after-action report and allowed himself a small, grim nod. It was a start, but he knew, deep in his bones, that the real war hadn't begun yet. The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. In that time, they had faced rebellions, border disputes, and the occasional species that refused to kneel. They had crushed all of them. They had done it with patience, with overwhelming force, and with the absolute certainty that they were the natural rulers of the galaxy. That certainty was the foundation of everything they had built. And now, for the first time, a crack had appeared in that foundation. But cracks can be ignored, and the Council was very good at ignoring things. After the defeat at Tau Ceti, the Draven hegemony demanded more ships, more resources, and more authority to deal with the human problem. The Council granted some of it and denied the rest. The Lirani, an ethereal species that communicated through light and sound, called the whole affair a distraction. The Tessic Concordants, an ancient race of crystalline beings who measured time in centuries, argued that humanity would exhaust itself within a generation. The Moran Collective, a species of quiet, calculating diplomats, said nothing publicly. Privately, they watched. Meanwhile, humanity was not exhausting itself. It was accelerating. Commodore Nathan Cole took command of the Second Fleet and launched a campaign that the galaxy would later remember as the Doctrine of Fury. His strategy was not complicated. He did not have the numbers to fight a traditional war. The Draven hegemony alone had thousands of warships, and the full council could field tens of thousands. Earth had a few hundred. So Cole didn't try to match them. Instead, he decided to break their spirit. The Second Fleet jumped from system to system along the Draven border, hitting targets fast and hard, and then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. They struck shipyards, fuel depots, communication relays, and supply lines. They didn't try to hold territory. They just destroyed everything they touched and moved on. It was hit-and-run warfare on a galactic scale, and it was devastatingly effective. The Draven had never fought an enemy like this. Their military doctrine was built on grand fleet engagements. Two armadas meeting in open space, exchanging fire in elegant formations, and the stronger fleet winning through superior numbers and technology. They had no plan for an enemy that refused to stand still, that attacked from 3 directions at once, that blew up a shipyard at dawn and was gone before lunch. Cole's officers began to earn their own reputations. Commander Megan Hobbs and the Ironclad became the fleet's hammer, leading the most dangerous assaults and somehow always coming back. She hit a Draven shipyard at Vorin Prime with just 8 ships, punched through its defenses, launched crack drive torpedoes into the construction bays, and escaped with the loss of only 2 frigates. The shipyard, one of the Draven's largest, was reduced to a field of spinning debris. The Draven had been building 40 new warships there. Now they were building nothing. Cole himself led a strike group deep into Draven territory and captured a communications hub that had been relaying orders across 3 star systems. He didn't destroy it. Instead, he had Dr. Vance's team plug into it and download everything they could before rigging it to explode. The data they pulled from that hub would change the course of the war. It took Vance 2 weeks to decode everything. When he was finished, he asked for a private meeting with Cole and sat across from him in a small room on the flagship, with a look on his face that Cole had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something deeper. It was the look of a man who had just learned that the world was crueler than he had ever imagined. "I found something," Vance said. "They call it the Ashfall Archive. It's a record, a complete record, of every species the Council has dealt with over the last 10,000 years. He paused. "Nathan, there are over 400 species on this list. 400. And next to every single one, there's a status report. Some say contained, some say reduced. Most of them say terminated." Cole stared at him. "Terminated. Wiped out," Vance said. "Destroyed. Erased. Every species that the Council identified as a potential threat was dealt with before it could grow strong enough to challenge them. Some were bombed back to a pre-industrial state. Some were enslaved. And some were simply killed, every last one of them, down to the last child." His voice cracked. "We weren't the first, Nathan. We were just the first ones who punched back hard enough to survive." Cole sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Send it to Whitfield, all of it." The Ashfall Archive reached President Whitfield's desk 3 days later. She read it alone in her office, and when she was done, she sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed for almost an hour. Then she called a meeting of her inner council and laid out what Vance had found. The room was silent. Some people cried. One general put his fist through a wall. Whitfield made a decision that night. She ordered the Ashfall Archive broadcast on every frequency, in every language, to every corner of the galaxy. She didn't ask the Council for permission. She simply opened a channel and let the truth pour out like water from a broken dam. The effect was immediate, and it was enormous. Dozens of species across the galaxy, species that had been conquered, diminished, or enslaved by the Council over thousands of years, heard the broadcast and learned, many for the first time, exactly what had been done to them. They had been told they were inferior. They had been told they had failed on their own. They had been told that the Council had saved them from themselves. Now they learned the truth. They had been crushed on purpose, systematically and deliberately, by a ruling class that had decided they were too dangerous to be free. The Kesari were the first to act. They were an insectoid species, tall, fast, and fierce, who had been forced into servitude by the Tessic Concordance 800 years ago. Within a week of the broadcast, Kesari workers on a dozen Tessic colony worlds stopped working. Within a month, they were fighting. Their uprising was bloody, chaotic, and unstoppable, because the Kesari had spent 8 centuries learning how to be patient, and now their patience had run out. Other species followed. The Vendari, a race of aquatic beings who had been penned into a single ocean world, sabotaged the orbital platforms that kept them contained. The Torsion, a nomadic people who had been stripped of their ships and grounded on a barren moon, broke into a Draven armory and armed themselves with stolen weapons. Fires were burning across the galaxy, and every one of them had been lit by the same spark: the truth. The Council convened an emergency session on Anthara. For the first time in living memory, the chamber was not orderly. Delegates shouted, accusations flew. The Lirani blamed the Draven for failing to contain humanity. The Draven blamed the Tessic for provoking the Kesari. The Tessic blamed everyone. And through it all, the Moran Collective sat quietly and said nothing. That evening, a Moran diplomat sent a coded message to Earth through a back channel that had been established weeks earlier. The message was short: "We would like to talk." On the bridge of his flagship, Nathan Cole read the message and showed it to Hobbs. "Do you trust them?" she asked. "No," Cole said. "But I don't need to trust them. I just need them to be smart enough to see which way the wind is blowing." The wind was blowing hard. The Council's order, 10,000 years in the making, was crumbling, and at the center of the storm, a species they had dismissed as primitive, violent, and worthless was tearing it apart. But the Council was not dead yet, and the Draven still had teeth. Deep in the Aran system, far from the front lines, High Marshal Dren Kalos, the Draven's most brilliant and most patient strategist, sat in his command chamber and studied every battle report, every human tactic, and every piece of data he could find about the species called humanity. He had replaced Vorath Sullen, who had been stripped of command for his failures. Where Vorath had been arrogant, Dren was careful. Where Vorath had underestimated humans, Dren respected them. And where Vorath had tried to swat them like insects, Dren was building a trap. He smiled, just barely, and placed his final piece on the board. High Marshal Dren Kalos understood something that no other Draven commander had been willing to accept. Humans were not stupid. They were not lucky. They were dangerous, genuinely dangerous, in a way that the galaxy had not seen in 10,000 years. Every other species that had risen against the Council had done so with anger and desperation. Humans fought with anger too, but they also fought with creativity, adaptability, and a terrifying willingness to sacrifice everything for a single objective. Dren respected this, and he intended to use it against them. The trap was elegant. Draven intelligence agents deliberately leaked information through channels they knew humanity had compromised. The leaked data pointed to a single location, Sethara Gate, a massive space station orbiting a dying red star in the Aran system. According to the false intelligence, Sethara Gate was the Draven's central command hub. It housed their war council, their strategic archives, and their fleet coordination systems. Destroy Sethara Gate, the data suggested, and the Draven war machine would collapse. It was exactly the kind of target that humans couldn't resist. One decisive blow, one chance to end the war in a single stroke. Dren knew they would come. He was counting on it. Admiral Greg Sutton studied the intelligence for a week. He consulted with his officers. He ran simulations. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Sethara Gate was real. It was important, and it was vulnerable. Sutton was a cautious man, but the war had been grinding on for 2 years, and Earth's resources were not infinite. If there was a chance to end this quickly, he had to take it. Nathan Cole disagreed. He sat across from Sutton in the war room aboard the UES Resolute and laid out his concerns with the calm, steady voice that everyone had come to know. "It's too clean. We've been fighting the Draven for 2 years, and we've never gotten intelligence this good. Someone wanted us to find this." Sutton shook his head. "Or maybe their security is finally falling apart. We've been hammering their infrastructure for months. Things slip through the cracks." "This didn't slip," Cole said. "This was placed." Sutton overruled him. The operation was approved. The combined human armada, over 500 ships, every vessel Earth could spare, would jump to the Aaron system and destroy Sethara Gate. It would be the largest military operation in human history. Cole accepted the order, but he did something that would later save the human race. He quietly held back the Third Fleet, 150 ships under his direct command, and told only Megan Hobbs what he was planning. "If I'm wrong, I'll be court-martialed," he said. "And if you're right? Then the Third Fleet is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction." The Armada jumped to the RN system on a cold morning in March. 500 human warships emerged from subspace in a tight formation, weapons hot, targeting systems locked on the massive structure of Sethara Gate ahead of them. For a brief moment, it looked exactly like the intelligence had promised. The station was there. The defenses were minimal. Victory seemed close enough to touch. Then the stars around them filled with ships. 1,200 Draven warships dropped out of warp in a sphere around the human fleet. Behind them came 200 Tessic battlecruisers, their crystalline hulls glowing with stored energy. And weaving between them, nearly invisible, were Lyrani electronic warfare platforms that immediately began flooding human sensors with noise and false signals. The trap had been sprung. And then Dren Kalos activated his final weapon, a network of subspace disruption generators hidden in the asteroid belt around the dying star. The generators fired, and every FTL drive in the system went dead. The humans couldn't run. They couldn't call for help. They were locked in a cage with 1,400 enemy warships. Dren Kalos transmitted a single message to the human fleet. "You have been brave. It was not enough." The Battle of Sethara Gate began at 0600 hours, and it lasted 14 hours. It was the bloodiest day in human history. The first 6 hours were a massacre. The Draven fleet closed in from every direction, pouring fire into the human formation. Tessic battlecruisers fired concentrated energy beams that cut through human armor plating like hot wire through ice. Lyrani platforms scrambled communications, leaving individual ships unable to coordinate. The human fleet, designed for fast strikes and quick escapes, was being forced into exactly the kind of grinding, stationary battle it was never built to fight. Admiral Sutton's flagship, the UES Resolute, took a direct hit from a Tessic beam weapon in the first hour. The shot tore through 3 decks and killed 60 crew members instantly. Sutton himself was thrown across the bridge and pinned under a fallen support beam. His left arm was shattered. His ribs were broken. Blood poured down his face from a gash above his eye. His officers begged him to evacuate. "I'm not leaving this bridge," he said through gritted teeth. "Get me a status report." The status report was grim. In the first 3 hours, humanity lost 80 ships. The fleet was being pushed into a tighter and tighter formation, exactly where the Draven wanted them. Sutton knew he was losing. He just didn't know how to stop it. Megan Hobbs did. The ironclad had taken damage. Its port armor was cracked. 2 of its railguns were offline, and a fire was burning in the lower decks that her crew was fighting to contain. But Hobbs was not the kind of person who waited for someone else to solve the problem. She grabbed command of the surviving ships in her sector and pulled them into a wedge formation, something no one had tried before in a space battle, because it concentrated your ships in a way that made them easy to hit. but it also concentrated their firepower into a single devastating point. "All ships, follow me," she transmitted. "We're going straight through them." The wedge drove into the Draven line like a spear. The ironclad led the charge, its remaining railguns firing at point-blank range, its hull scraping against Draven warships as it forced its way through. Ships died on both sides. The formation was chaos. But Hobbs punched through the Draven line and reached open space on the other side, pulling 40 surviving ships with her. It wasn't a victory, but it gave the fleet room to breathe. And then Nathan Cole arrived. The Third Fleet, 150 ships that Dren Kalos didn't know existed, emerged from a blind subspace jump on the far side of the Aren system. Cole had calculated the jump using incomplete data and a lot of faith. Half his navigators had told him the jump was too risky, that they could emerge inside the star or scattered across 1,000,000 kilometers of empty space. Cole had looked at them and said, "Then we'd better get it right." They got it right. The Third Fleet appeared behind the Draven formation, exactly where their subspace disruption generators were anchored. Cole didn't hesitate. He ordered every ship to target the generators and fire everything they had. Railgun slugs and nuclear torpedoes slammed into the asteroid belt in a storm of metal and fire. One by one, the disruption generators died. The subspace field that had trapped the human fleet began to collapse. Dren Kalos saw what was happening and turned his reserves to face Cole, but it was too late. The cage was open. The moment FTL capability was restored, Hobbs launched every crack drive torpedo the fleet had left. Not at the Draven ships, at the space between them. The torpedoes detonated in the heart of the enemy formation, tearing holes in reality itself. Draven, Tessic, and Lirani ships were pulled into the ruptures and crushed like tin cans in a closing fist. The dying star, already unstable, shuddered from the gravitational distortions. Its surface erupted in a wave of radiation that forced both fleets to scatter. When the light faded and the sensors cleared, the battle was over. The Draven had lost over 400 ships. The Tessic and Lirani had lost dozens more. Sithara Gate itself had been torn apart by the subspace ruptures and swallowed by the star's expanding corona. Humanity had lost 187 ships and over 30,000 people. Admiral Sutton was evacuated to a medical ship. He survived, but his injuries ended his career. His last order from the bridge of the Resolute was to promote Nathan Cole to full admiral. Megan Hobbs was awarded the Medal of Terra, the highest honor Earth could give. When they told her about the award, she was sitting on the floor of the ironclad's damaged bridge, covered in soot and someone else's blood, eating a ration bar. "That's nice," she said. "Can someone fix my ship?" The aftermath of Sithara Gate rippled across the galaxy. The Tessic Concordance formally withdrew from the war, declaring that the cost was no longer acceptable. The Lirani followed within days. The Draven stood alone, their greatest strategist defeated, their fleet shattered, their allies gone. Dren Kalos submitted his resignation and disappeared into exile. And the Moran Collective, who had been watching and waiting all along, sent a new message to Earth. This time it wasn't through a back channel. It was a formal diplomatic transmission, broadcast openly for the entire galaxy to see. The Moran Collective offers its hand in alliance to the people of Earth. The old order is falling. Let us build something better. The galaxy was tired. It had been 3 years since the massacre at New Rochelle, 2 years since the Doctrine of Fury had set the Draven border on fire, and 3 months since the Battle of Sethera Gate had shattered the myth that the Council could not be beaten. Across 1,000 star systems, the old order was breaking apart. Rebellions burned on worlds that had been silent for centuries. Species that had been crushed and forgotten were rising, some with weapons, some with words, and all of them with the same message. We are done being told we don't matter. The Galactic Council still existed on paper. Its chambers on Anthara were still standing. Its delegates still held their seats. But the power behind those seats was gone. The Draven hegemony, once the military fist of the Council, had been broken at Sethera Gate. Its war council had fractured into 3 factions. One that wanted to keep fighting, one that wanted to surrender, and one that simply wanted someone to blame. The Tessic and the Lirani had pulled their fleets back to their home systems and closed their borders. The smaller council species were scrambling to make deals with anyone who would listen, and the Moran Collective had walked out of the council entirely and joined hands with Earth. Admiral Nathan Cole stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the UES Tempest, and looked at the fleet assembled around him. 300 human warships, 120 Moran cruisers, sleek silver vessels that moved like fish through water. And behind them, a scattered collection of Kasari fighters, Vendari transports, and Torsion raiding ships. The free species, the ones who had broken their chains because humanity had shown them it was possible. It was the strangest fleet ever assembled. It was also the most powerful. Cole's orders from President Whitfield were clear. Go to Anthara. End this, but don't conquer it. I don't want an empire, Whitfield had told him in their last conversation. Empires are what got us into this mess. I want a table where everyone gets a seat, even the ones we're angry at. Cole had nodded. He understood. The hardest part of winning a war wasn't the fighting. It was deciding what to do when the fighting stopped. The fleet jumped to Anthara. When they emerged from subspace, every screen on the bridge filled with the image of the hollow world. An enormous sphere, half natural rock and half ancient metal, glowing faintly with the light of 1,000 internal cities. Anthara was the oldest inhabited structure in the galaxy. It had been the seat of power for 10,000 years, and now a human fleet was parked in its sky. The Council's remaining defense fleet, a few hundred ships from half a dozen species, none of them eager to die for a cause they no longer believed in, pulled back and let the human armada pass. Cole didn't fire a shot. Instead, he began broadcasting the Ashfall archive on every frequency in the system, just as Whitfield had done months before. But this time, he added something new. He added the names. Vance had spent the last 3 months working with Kasari historians, Vendari record-keepers, and Torsion storytellers to piece together the identities of the 400 species the Council had destroyed. Not all of them could be recovered. Some had been erased so thoroughly that not even their names survived. But for those that could be identified, Vance compiled a list. Names, homeworlds, descriptions, fragments of their languages and their art. He called it the Book of Echoes. And now, it was playing on every screen on Anthara. An endless scroll of civilizations that had been murdered in secret and silence. The Council delegates watched it from their chamber. Some looked away. Some couldn't. Cole transmitted an open message. His voice was calm and steady. The same voice that had carried him through every battle, every loss, every impossible decision of the last 3 years. We didn't come here to replace you, he said. We came here because no one should have the power to decide which species gets to live and which gets erased. You built this council on a graveyard. You told yourselves it was necessary. You told yourselves it was for the greater good. But there is no greater good that requires the murder of children who haven't been born yet. The silencing of songs that haven't been sung. The destruction of futures that never got a chance to exist. He paused. That ends now. Not tomorrow. Not after negotiations. Now. The silence that followed lasted a long time. It was broken by the Moran ambassador, a small, gray-skinned figure who stood in the council chamber and addressed the elder species with a voice that trembled with something between sadness and relief. He is right, the Moran said. We all know he is right. We have known for a very long time. We were simply too afraid to say it. The Draven made one last attempt to fight. A faction of hardliners. A group of officers who would rather die than accept that their empire was over, gathered what ships they had left, and launched a desperate attack on the Tempest. It was a suicide run, 30 ships against 300, and everyone knew how it would end. Meg and Hobbs moved the ironclad into their path before Cole even gave the order. The ironclad was tired. It had been repaired a dozen times since the war began, patched and welded and bolted back together so many times that almost none of its original hull remained. It was more scar tissue than ship, but it still flew, and Hobbs still commanded it. And when the Draven dreadnought at the head of the suicide charge came screaming toward the Tempest, Hobbs put the ironclad directly in its way. The collision was enormous. The Draven dreadnought hit the ironclad at full speed, and both ships crumpled together in a storm of metal, fire, and escaping atmosphere. The impact threw Hobbs across the bridge and into a bulkhead. Her left shoulder shattered. Her vision went white. Alarms screamed. Someone was yelling her name. She could feel the ship dying around her. The groan of twisting metal, the hiss of air escaping, the shudder of systems failing, one by one. They dragged her through a corridor that was already filling with smoke, and loaded her onto an escape pod with 11 other survivors. As the pod launched, Hobbs pressed her good hand against the viewport and watched the ironclad break apart. The ship that carried her through every battle, every charge, every impossible moment of the war, came apart slowly, like an old friend sitting down for the last time. She didn't cry. She just watched until there was nothing left to see. The remaining Draven attackers were destroyed within minutes. The suicide charge had failed. And in the silence that followed, something shifted on Anthara. The fight went out of the room. The last defenders of the old order looked at the wreckage floating in their sky and understood, finally and completely, that the age of the Council was over. The vote to dissolve the Galactic Council was not unanimous. 3 species voted against it, but 9 voted in favor, and that was enough. 10,000 years of rule ended with a show of hands in a chamber that suddenly felt very old and very small. In its place, a new body was proposed, the Galactic Accord. Its principles were simple: transparency, mutual sovereignty, the absolute prohibition of species suppression. No more secret lists, no more silent exterminations, no more deciding that an entire civilization didn't deserve to exist. Earth was offered a founding seat. President Whitfield accepted, but she had a condition. The Kesari would have a seat. The Morin would have a seat. The Vendari, the Torsion, and every other species that had been victimized by the old council would sit at the same table with the same voice. There would be no elder species. There would be no lesser species. There would just be species, together, trying to do better than the ones who came before them. The accord was ratified on the anniversary of the New Rochelle massacre. Whitfield chose the date on purpose. She wanted the galaxy to remember where this had started. She wanted them to remember the 42,000 people who had died because someone decided they were insects. The signing ceremony was held in the old council chamber on Anthara. It was crowded. Delegates from over 40 species filled the room, many of them standing because there weren't enough seats. The seats would be built later. For now, what mattered was that everyone was there. Nathan Cole stood near the back of the room, with Megan Hobbs beside him. Her arm was in a sling, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a week, which she hadn't. Lucas Vance stood on Cole's other side, holding a datapad that contained the Book of Echoes, because he carried it everywhere now, and probably always would. A Lorani delegate approached Cole after the ceremony. The Lorani were tall, luminous beings, and this one glowed with soft blue light that pulsed with every word. "I have a question," the Lorani said. "Your species was alone. You were small, You were surrounded by powers that were older and stronger in every way. How did you survive? Cole looked at the Lirani for a moment. Then he looked out at the chamber full of species that had come together, not because they were the same, but because they had all suffered enough to know that something had to change. He looked at Hobbs, who was already arguing with a Kasari delegate about fleet logistics. He looked at Vance, who was showing the Book of Echoes to a young Vendari, who had never seen the name of her own ancestors written down before. "Because we've always been fighting something bigger than us," Cole said. "You just gave us a reason to do it together." Outside, the stars burned on, the same as they always had. But the galaxy beneath them was different now. It was scarred, wounded, and uncertain. It was also, for the first time in 10,000 years, free. And somewhere on the edge of known space, a new ship was being built. It was smaller than the Tempest, faster than the Ironclad, and its hull was unpainted because its captain hadn't decided on a color yet. Admiral Nathan Cole had been offered a seat on the Accord Council. He had been offered the presidency of the UEC military. He had turned down both. "There are still stars out there that nobody's seen," he told Whitfield. "I'd like to go look at them." She had smiled and signed the authorization herself. The ship launched on a quiet morning, with a small crew of volunteers, no weapons, and an open channel broadcasting a simple message in every language humanity had ever learned, including a few new ones. The message said, "We come in peace, but don't push it." Megan Hobbs, watching the launch from a hospital bed on Anthara, where she was refusing to stay for the recommended recovery period, laughed when she heard it. "That's the most human thing I've ever heard," she said. And then she got up, signed herself out against medical advice, and went to find out if they needed a weapons officer. Just in case.